Good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's presentation of Decoding the Rosetta Stone with Edward Dolnick. His new book, Writing of the Gods, is available through our bookshop.org link, and everywhere fine books are sold. I noticed a whole lot of members on the roster for this evening's program, and that is wonderful. We love seeing our members participate in our programs. If you found out about this program from your friend, a member, and would like to become one yourself, head on over to planetwordmuseum.org. It's easy to sign up for our newsletter, find out about our upcoming programs. Members also do get some exclusive events and some previews. We have a couple of actually really great, both virtual and in-person things coming up. Virtually, we have Clint Smith next week about his book, How the Word is Passed. We also are launching a new programming stream called Language Ampersand, which explores the intersection of language and a lot of other disciplines. It's going to be a monthly virtual series starting in February with language and games. Then we've got language and climate, language and food, and then language and gender are our first four, but we're going to do them monthly forever. And we're going to explore some really interesting intersections. We also are going to be announcing something pretty cool in the museum coming up next month. So sign up for our newsletter. I am sworn to secrecy until February when it is announced to our members first. But the newsletter and following us on social media are the best ways to get that sort of information. And I think that's all of the business. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome Edward Dolnick and his new book, Writing of the Gods. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, glad to be here.
So I really loved the book. And I come with, sort of the base knowledge of what the Rosetta Stone is and why it was important. And I've, paid my pilgrimage at the British Museum. But why don't you catch us up just a little bit on the history of where it was found, who ended up with it, and how it became something people recognized as the key to understanding these languages?
Well, it turned up in 1799 in Egypt in a town called Rosetta. That's why it's the Rosetta Stone. The English and the French at this point are knocking heads. They're battling each other all around the world. It's essentially the First World War, even though we call a later war that. So England and France are chasing each other around. One of the places they do battle is Egypt, for no certain reason, just why they should be there. Egypt is not a treasure. It's not rich. In fact, it hasn't been rich for thousands of years. Nonetheless, it's strategically placed. The English and the French are both there. The French are trying to reinforce a fort at a place where they believe the English will attack. They've got a bunch of tumbled down rocks from an old fort that they're trying to reassemble so that the fort will be strong and robust. And in the course of shoving these blocks into place, one of the workmen, presumably, no one knows his name, sees that one of these blocks, which is big, it's about as big as a cemetery headstone, has some writing on the side of it. And he says to the lieutenant, the soldier in charge of this reconstruction, is this something that might be interesting? And by good fortune, the lieutenant he tells that to is a bright fellow who amidst the hustle and bustle and commotion of an impending battle, takes time to look at this strange stone with its marks on it and says, good Lord, yes, that's a big deal. That's important. Where the Rosetta Stone had been until 1799, when it turned up, no one knew where it had been. No one knew that there was such a thing. It had presumably been in place in this fort, which had tumbled down over the years. So someone had taken this magnificent treasure, looked at it as a block of stone, put it in a wall in this a nondescript wall at a nondescript fort in a nondescript town, and only in 1799, as I say, as they prepare for this battle, did someone notice it? So at 1799, someone has just found the Rosetta Stone. There's not much time to do anything with it, but in even a quick glance at it, you see that it's got what looks like writing on it. And better than that, it's different kinds of writing. There are three different types. The writing at the top of this stone is hieroglyphs. The people knew the look of them. No one in 2,000 years had been able to read them, but these are the circles and stars and snakes and birds that you see in hieroglyphs. There's 14 lines of those. A lot are missing. The stone is broken at the top where the hieroglyphs are. And then there's a section in the middle of a different kind of script that no one knows at all what to make of. It's not pictures like the hieroglyphs, but if it's an alphabet, no one recognizes it. No one knows what to make of that at all. And then at the bottom, and this is what makes the first person to see the Rosetta Stone, the first people, what makes them thrilled, at the bottom is Greek. And scholars know perfectly well how to read Greek. And it's instantly clear that if there are three different kinds of writing on this same stone, the only guess that makes sense at all is that it says the same thing three ways. And people are thrilled with this because Egypt had been the great power in the ancient world. Hieroglyphs had been everywhere in Egypt. Every surface is covered with them. No one knew what they meant. No one knew what Egypt had been up to through all the centuries of its reign. Now here's the hope that with this Greek and with these hieroglyphs on the same stone, finally you'll be able to figure out what in the world the hieroglyphs were. And the first scholars to look at it figured that it might take 2 weeks to crack that mystery. And as it turned out, it took 20 years.
And just briefly, in terms of its materials, because it did endure, but it was misidentified as basalt because it was so dark.
Yeah, it is quite dark. It's a hunk of rock. In Egypt, Egypt is so dry that there are hardly any trees. So important things are built of stone rather than of wood. So it was a building block. Using it as a building block is like using a Gutenberg Bible as a doorstop, but nonetheless, that is what had become of it. So it's recognized at once as valuable. It's going to be a big deal. But in the meantime, England and France are battling. It's the French who have found the stone, but as it turns out, it's England who ends up winning the battles in Egypt. So the English say to the French, why don't we take any treasures you might have found, including this very handsome stone? And that's why you, Rebecca, when you go to London, you see it in the British Museum. You don't see it in Paris because the English were so thrilled to run home with it.
And I understand it is the most visited object in the British Museum and the longest, or one of the longest, continually displayed objects. It's been famous for a very long time.
It was a star from the get-go. I forgot to say that it's actually grayish rather than black. The reason that people early on talked about it as black is that when the British put it on display, so many people who came by to look at it would rub their fingers along the marks by way of homage, that it gradually got dark and oily, and eventually people took it to be black. It wasn't quite. It is the most popular thing in the British Museum. The gift shop has mouse pads and handkerchiefs and backpacks, and it's their best-selling postcard. I had a postcard of it on my bulletin board for 20 years before it dawned on me to think maybe there's a story there.
Well, I want to get into the story, but first tell me how people figured out what that center language was between the hieroglyphs and the Greek.
Well, people made a mistake, the scholars and decipherers. The hieroglyphs they knew were bewildering. And this middle script looked approachable, and they started there. They tried to match it up with the Greek. Maybe the first squiggle in that middle section corresponded to the first letters in Greek or something like that. Maybe you could match. It turned out much later on that this middle section was a kind of shorthand. Hieroglyphs are so elegant, but so cumbersome that you wouldn't want to use them for ordinary writing. You would use them for inscriptions and great things like that. So this middle section, which is called Demotic, was a kind of shorthand, quick version of the hieroglyphs. So it would have been even harder to read than hieroglyphs because you didn't have pictures to guide you, some kind of a hint of what you might be looking at. All you had was these squiggles. Some modern scholar says that this Demotic looks like just a hodgepodge of agitated commas. It's almost impossible to make sense of. But the early scholars thought they should start there because they thought it looked like a script. It turned out to be exactly the wrong place to start.
Yeah, you say in the book, and it is logical, right? If you are looking for an alphabet and you're trying to match it up with an alphabet like Greek, then this kind of looks like an alphabet. Let's start with an alphabet. It's completely logical, but as you say, it's like going from the starting line straight into a ditch.
Yeah, it wasn't a good place to start, as it turned out.
So how did anybody outside of a curated museum world even get a chance to try to take a crack at it?
Well, this world is at war, or at least the European war, and so communication is terribly difficult. But actually, the British did pretty well with this. They quickly figured out how you the inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone, kind of in the way that little kids do those potato block prints in kindergarten. You press paper on. So it wasn't too much more sophisticated than that, but it made copies, and they sent them to all the major linguists throughout Europe. So quite early on, in the middle of wartime, you had a bunch of scholars in different countries trying to make sense of these mysterious marks.
We had a quick question from the audience about who used Demotic. Whose language was it?
It's a language of ancient Egypt, or a script of ancient Egypt. It's used to write Egyptian. It's the same language, but a different script.
So one of the things that I think is so interesting about this is the notion that the barriers to entry to become a Rosetta Stone decoder are pretty low, right? You don't need particularly specialized tools. You need some education and some sense of how languages work. But a lot of people, if they've got the access to the images, can take a crack at this. So ultimately, some big players emerged, but it became something of a game, a sport, to try to be the person who cracks the code.
Well, yes, that's exactly so. And one of the things that drew me into the story is that this deciphering mystery, unlike lots of mysteries, is one that you can get pretty deeply in. If you're trying to unravel something about physics or something about computer codes or something, very quickly you get to the point where you say, and then someone brilliant did something brilliant. But it's hard to capture exactly what that was. But here you can get far into it, and it's inviting, as you say, because what you're looking at is a sparrow and a snake and a star. It looks like a puzzle that a person ought to be able to crack.
Although I think the limits of hieroglyphs as an analog for alphabets that we understand as English or French speakers are also really interesting. I mean, at one point you note that scholars had identified 958 symbols, which is exactly the wrong number, right? It's far too many to be an alphabet. That would be totally unwieldy if 958 different sounds were represented, but it's not enough to be that each one is a word. You can't have a functioning language with fewer than 1,000 words. So it was a stumper from the beginning.
Yeah, it took a while, a surprising while, for it to dawn on somebody that they ought to just count, and maybe that would give some clue as to what was going on. But it's exactly as you say, when you do count, all of a sudden you get these numbers that don't make any sense at all. And so now the scholars looking at this go from thinking, easy peasy, we've got these pieces lined up, we'll just match, to thinking, wow, even the most basic thing, how many symbols there are, doesn't make any sense at all. And so they're really stymied early on.
So it doesn't take 2 weeks. A lot of people give up, but there are two players who really just won't let this go, and they become rivals. Tell us about these two main characters, one English, one French.
Well, part of what made writing the book and learning about this stuff so fun is that it was a story. It wasn't just an essay, and it's a story because it's a race. It's a contest between two rival geniuses who are utterly unlike one another and don't have much use for each other. One is English, one is French, which is fun because, as I say, the two countries are at war. So our rival geniuses are fighting not only for the glory that will come from being the one to crack this 2,000-year-old mystery, but they're fighting for national glory as well. Because the English wants to say, here we have this treasure in our national museum, and we'll tell you what it means. And the French want to be able to say, well, you grabbed it away from us, but you don't even know what it is that you've got. We'll tell you that. So there's this rivalry. Thomas Young is the Englishman. He's a brilliant physicist, but brilliant at everything he's ever taken the least notice of, and he's taken notice of nearly everything. He's an all-around dazzling genius. At Cambridge, at college, he's phenomenon young. He's called by everybody because no matter what you ask him, he knows immediately. He was a child prodigy. He speaks half a dozen languages. He figured out how waves work in physics in a way that showed that Isaac Newton had missed the point. Just a dauntingly brilliant, quiet, calm, kind of pleased with himself, sneering, cool customer. The Frenchman, his rival, Jean-Francois Champollion, is utterly different in character. He's histrionic, over the top. Every day is either the most magnificent day of his life or the worst calamity. He's surrounded by fools and idiots. Life is mayhem. Young is interested in everything that crosses his path. Champollion cares only about Egypt, but obsessively about Egypt. He's been fascinated with it since he was a boy. He too, like Young, was a child prodigy. He too knew half a dozen languages from early on. So now it comes, neither one in the early stages of this race knows that the other one even exists. They've both got the Rosetta Stone. They're both determined to crack this mystery. Young because he can crack every mystery. Champollion because this is a great mystery and Egypt is his great cause. So Young wants to solve a riddle. Champollion wants to probe a culture. The two of them are utterly different, and they're, unbeknownst to each other, racing one another.
And what tactics did they take, given their different skills and interests?
So Young starts first. Every summer he would take the summer off. He had both of them. I said they were utterly different, but they were both had financial problems early on. Young was one of 10 children, I think. But when he's in college, a rich uncle dies, leaves him a fortune. From now on, Young's life is smooth sailing. He's a doctor by profession, and that brings in money. But this family fortune is even better. So he takes off every summer, retreats to his summer house and ponders whatever puzzle has come his way. And in 1814, people are buzzing about this Rosetta Stone, and he says, this is, I'm good at this. Let me add it. And people say, no, nobody's ever done this. The last person who could read these things was 2,000 years ago. Scholars all across Europe have tried it. And he says, I understand. Let me have a copy.
I'm phenomenon Young.
So he settles down. He's working. And 2 months later, he writes a letter to a friend of his. He says, you know, you're not going to believe this. I can hardly believe this, but I haven't gotten anywhere. In the meantime, Champollion has taken a different approach. He's looked at these inscriptions quite carefully, hasn't gotten anywhere. And his approach, rather than trying to crack a code as a kind of crossword puzzle or Sudoku mystery, is to immerse himself all the deeper into Egyptian culture. The language Egyptian was a dead language, so you couldn't go directly to Egyptian. But after Egyptian, the language that came along in ancient Egypt was Coptic. And Coptic was a language that you could still hear in the Coptic Christian church. There were things you could read. Champollion gets it in his head at about age 12, something like this, that Coptic is going to prove the key to deciphering the hieroglyphs. If he can absorb this language into his brain, into his heart, somehow the sounds of that successor language to Egyptian will be the lifeline that he'll be able to climb, which will pull him back to the real mystery, ancient Egyptian. So Young is engaged in this Sudoku kind of approach. Champollion is taking a more linguistic approach. Neither of them is making much headway.
And they're working from, obviously this is a pre-photography era, so they're working from reproductions that were sketched. And were they hard to get, and were they accurate? And I mean,
it's
did they even have the right base material?
It's important, as you say, that this is before photography. So photography is more or less Civil War era, but we're 1810, 1820. So what they're depending on is either someone's copy of handwritten hieroglyphs, or a physical print, like a block print, like this potato print. Of the hieroglyphs, but you can get mistakes either way, because the impression might not be neat enough, or all the more so with people who copy down writing. It's terribly hard to copy writing in a script that you don't know. If you think of someone trying to copy English who didn't know that P's and Q's are different in I's and J's and all the rest, you can imagine how they would quickly run into problems. And it was far worse with hieroglyphs, where is a squiggly snake the same as a snake with one bend in his middle? Or how about the snake that has two little horns on his head? Is that different, or is that just artistic license? So yes, knowing what to start with was itself a big problem.
Mm-hmm. And that's just even under, that's just what you're looking at, let alone what it represents, right? I mean, you make the point a couple times in the book that languages, unless you invent them, unless it's, Klingon invented for a book, they emerge chaotically, right? The rules are not laid down in some logical fashion. And so if you're trying to reverse engineer a language, you're not going to always come across easy to follow rules.
Yeah, languages, the rules of language are just madness, as everyone who learns English as a second language points out. Spelling is terrible, grammar is terrible. But more than that, as you say, there is this kind of organic quality to languages, so that it made for a big difference, although people hadn't anticipated the difference between code breakers who were trying to crack military codes and decipherers like Young and Champollion, who were trying to crack languages that had arisen naturally. Because the military codes, although it was terribly hard to break them, were much easier. They played by rules. Kind of grown-up version of the kid rules, that if you're making a code, you A equals 1, B equals 2, that kind of thing. There's a trick to it, and if you can catch on to that trick, you're home free. And the trick will be one that the code breakers stick to. Whereas language, sometimes you'll say who, and sometimes you'll say whom, and just when you do it, is a giant complicated mess. So these decipherers didn't have the advantage of looking at a system that followed strict rules. And to make sense of it, they had to find their way into this utterly strange bygone culture. If someone were trying to understand English, some archaeologists from thousands of years now, they might see some writing with a light bulb over somebody's head, and they would have to guess that meant I've got a good idea, or they would find expressions like cold shoulder or red herring, and they would have to guess at what in the world those could have meant. Languages were far harder. Another thing I should say, in fact, is that the military codes, not only were they easier to break, but you could tell if you were on the right track. If you decoded something and it said attack, say, or it said retreat, that would make sense. When you're trying to decode these languages, you might come up with nearly anything. You wouldn't know if the swan is on the rise was a lovely poetic phrase, or if it was complete nonsense and you'd gone wrong altogether. So the decipherers had a hard task.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, languages are hard by accident, codes are hard on purpose, and that is all the difference. Plus the narrow field. You know the universe of things you might be trying to decode in a military parameter. This could be anything. It could be any form of text. So both of them took this key of starting with proper names, which I think when you think about it, seems obvious in retrospect, but why is starting with proper names a clever way in?
Well, what happened as the decipherers looked at the Rosetta Stone, the Greek which they could read was all about a pharaoh named Ptolemy. And it said Ptolemy did this and Ptolemy did that and did the other. When you were looking from the Greek to the hieroglyphs, since they presumably said the same thing, whatever you saw in the Greek should appear somewhere in the hieroglyphs. But if the Greek said, for instance, today is a wonderful day to do battle, you would have no way of guessing what kind of hieroglyphs would correspond to today is a wonderful day. But because presumably the Egyptian words for today and battle and all the rest of it would be different from the Greek. So you wouldn't be able to go back and forth. But the names, if Ptolemy appeared in the Greek, that would mean that Ptolemy ought to appear in the hieroglyphs as well. That shouldn't change in the way that ordinary words change from language to language. We say house and the French say maison, and it makes sense that those are different. But if we say Biden, the French also say Biden. So if we were looking at a French text, not knowing anything, nonetheless, we could at least pick out the word Biden in a French newspaper or something. And so something like that was the first clue, and it was Young who was the first to exploit it. He said the most conspicuous feature in the Greek is this name Ptolemy that appears over and over again. And therefore, he says, it must be that the name Ptolemy is hidden in those hieroglyphs over and over again. And the most conspicuous feature visually of the hieroglyphs were that certain of them were enclosed in a little oval. There were about half a dozen of these ovals, and each time they had the same string of hieroglyphs in them. So what Thomas Young guessed, and this was the first breakthrough, is those ovals look different from all the rest of the hieroglyphs. They enclose something, and it must be that what they enclose is important. And the most important thing is the name of the pharaoh, Ptolemy. So his first guess was that string of hieroglyphs within an oval corresponded to the name Ptolemy. The first hieroglyph was the first sound in Ptolemy, the second was the second sound, and so on. That was his first guess. It was only a guess, but it was a smart guess, and it turned out to be right. And it was the first word in hieroglyphs that anyone had read in 1500 years. And Thomas Young had put his ear to that manuscript, and he'd heard this sound that had been silent all those centuries, and now he had heard it.
And that's remarkable for so many reasons, not just for its brilliance, but looking at hieroglyphs, you don't know where one word ends and begins. You don't know if it's written left to right or up and down. You don't have any clues when you're starting with a completely unfamiliar language. And so to just kind of put his flag in the sand that this one bit of it I can translate, and let's start there, was an amazing breakthrough. It really was.
Yeah, the 20 years, which sounds so long, if you think about trying, if you and I were to try to decipher Chinese, say, if someone gave us a manuscript written in Chinese, there would be all the problems that you say. Do we go side to side? Which side, up or down? And we don't speak Chinese. So even if we could figure out a way to sound these things out, how would we know what it was that we had sounded? And that's with the advantage that Chinese is a language that is in common use and has been for a long, long while. If Chinese had been a dead language and we were trying to read it with all the obstacles that you say, suddenly that 20 years begins to seem like, well, it's remarkable that they did it ever. How in the world would you do that?
Add that they didn't have computers, right? That they were doing this all pen and paper.
Yes, this is all by hand.
So Young keeps trying to sort of chip away at the Demotic. At some point, his rival figures out, with his knowledge of Coptic, that maybe that's not the best way to go. So how does the story continue?
What happens is Young figured out this, or thought he had, this Ptolemy that we talked about, that this string of hieroglyphs in the oval said Ptolemy. And so he starts looking for more of these ovals in different hieroglyphs. In the Rosetta Stone, the only ovals, they're called cartouches because the French thought they looked like cartridges, rifles. He starts looking for more of these cartouches in different hieroglyph manuscripts, on the theory that these cartouches symbolize that something important is here. What could be more important than the names of rulers? And so he will be able to read other names like that. So that's what Young is doing, and he actually succeeds, or it seems that, starting with the hieroglyphs he's guessed from Ptolemy, he's able to guess at other names, and he writes this up. He writes an article. Here's what I've done. It's pretty marvelous. And now Champollion in Paris, Young is in London. Champollion hears about this, that this fellow has written up something, and he says it's so great. And Champollion says, it can't be up to much. I've never heard of this fellow. He's not a linguist. It's probably nothing there. But just in case, he says to his brother, who's got better access to libraries than he does, get me a copy of what this fellow Young has written. And either Champollion reads that and hears the story we just talked about Ptolemy and the cartouche and how that met, or at about the same time, the light dawns on him too. At any rate, Champollion now says exactly the same thing that Young had said. I notice he says that there are these cartouches, they must be special, there are hieroglyphs in them, I can read the name Ptolemy. So now the race is even. But then what happens is, it's fine to read a name like this, but it's like putting one answer in a crossword puzzle. You don't know if you're right or not, and there's no way you can check it. You need, in a crossword, something that crosses this. And what happens next is somebody finds another cartouche. This one, they have reason to think it says Cleopatra in Egyptian. It's not our Cleopatra, it's another Cleopatra. The Egyptians, they reused blocks to build things, and they reused names over and over again. There's dozens of Cleopatras and Ptolemies. At any rate, someone finds a cartouche that says, or that they hope says Cleopatra. Now Champollion looks at that. By good fortune, several of the letters in Cleopatra are the same as letters in Ptolemy. They both have a P, they both have a T, they both have an O, they both have an L. And so if Young and Champollion were right that certain hieroglyphs spelled out Ptolemy, then you could make a guess, like in Wheel of Fortune, about did this new cartouche really spell out Cleopatra? You'd put in the letters, the P's and the T's and the L's, and you'd see if that made it look as if it could be Cleopatra. Champollion did that. It worked. And so now he had not only confirmation, he had not only two pieces of the crossword that crossed and that made sense together, but he had a bunch of new hieroglyphs that he'd been able to identify. And so Young had drawn first blood in this race, then Champollion had caught up, and now Champollion's pulled ahead, and in fact, zooms ahead for a long while now. It's going to be Champollion in the lead and Young saying, wait a minute.
So we said about half an hour ago that hieroglyphs aren't an alphabet, that each symbol doesn't stand for a sound, because we counted the number of symbols and it was the wrong number for it to be an alphabet. So how did they spell out Ptolemy and Cleopatra?
Right. So one of the reasons, yet another reason for our 20-year mystery, is that hieroglyphs are this terribly confusing jumble, so that if you had a picture of a bird, say of an eagle, sometimes it meant here's an eagle, as in the sentence, I went for a walk and oh my God, I saw an eagle. But sometimes it would stand for the sound E, the first sound of eagle, in the way that we use A is for apple. So there were complicated rules. They hadn't sorted them out yet, but hieroglyphs could stand for sounds like E, or they could stand for concepts like the eagle could stand for bravery and justice, things like this. So the reason there are so many, or one of the reasons, is that yes, they stand for sounds, but some of them stand for concepts. Some of them actually are emblems of the thing that they look like. And the rules for when you read it one way and when you read it another way were terribly complicated. But the reason that the count was so different was that there weren't just 24 hieroglyphs like we have 26 letters. They could have done things that way if they'd wanted, but they preferred a much more ornate, elegant, maddening system than that.
Yeah, you sum this up in the following paragraph, which I am going to read because it's so much clearer than I could possibly paraphrase. It says, he had found years earlier that hieroglyphs could stand for a sound, like the P in Ptolemy or the L in Cleopatra. He had shown that hieroglyphs could stand for the objects they depicted, as with a sun or an arm. He had shown they could be rebuses, right? So almost a word puzzle in graphic form, as in duck for sun. Now he proposed another usage, and I'm jumping ahead in the story here, but this is just goes to show you how maddening hieroglyphs were. A hieroglyph might look exactly like any other hieroglyph, but function solely as a silent guide to the meaning of other hieroglyphs.
Yeah, it was from outside an astonishingly perverse system. But this business of hieroglyphs that told what other hieroglyphs meant was a big part of the puzzle and really useful. They're called determinatives because they determine what certain hieroglyphs mean. They were kind of hints to the reader. So at first they sound terribly confusing, but once you have the system explained, you see it's actually a good system. So that if you have certain hieroglyphs which mean old and frail, say, those are followed by one of these determinatives, one of these clues, which shows a drawing of an old, frail man. Or the hieroglyphs that spell out cat are followed by a determinative, which is a little drawing of a cat. So these are kind of answers hidden in the text. They say, yes, your laborious sounding out is on the right track. That was cat. And to confirm it, to underline it, here is a drawing of a cat. That's exactly what you were after. You've got it. You're on the right track. So it seems as if these would be just one more difficult thing to throw in. Here's a symbol that we don't read. It's a clue to other symbols, but they actually were a big help because they told you, yes, what you had guessed in your laborious sounding out was right. You had it right.
One of the things that I found amazing in the story, and there are many things to find amazing in the story, and I highly recommend the book, is that people were very invested in hieroglyphs being mystical and important in a almost otherworldly way, and resisted the notion that they were just communication tools like anything else. There was something, people wanted them to be different and better.
The hieroglyphs look so elegant. They're so meticulous and so beautifully drawn, and they show eagles and serpents and things like this. That the assumption for thousands of years by the most eminent scholars in the world were that if they looked so elegant and winning and mystical, they must in fact be elegant and winning and mystical. And so the notion that this was the way that if you lived in Egypt, you would write, don't forget to bring home milk for the kids. No one could believe that hieroglyphs could have such mundane uses. They had to be expressing truth about the nature of nature or the depth of the cosmos or some such thing. And they weren't. It was just an odd way of writing. But the belief that they were deep and mystical and hard to penetrate had such deep hold that no one could look beyond it to this puzzle solving, much more basic layer.
So we've got a bunch of questions from the audience that I want to get to, but I do have to ask the sort of big one, which is, what does the Rosetta Stone say? What did it turn out to say?
Well, it's kind of an amazing story what it says. There are a handful of terribly important written documents in the world, the Declaration of Independence and the Magna Carta and things like that. And they're so important because they say great things when in the course of human events. But the Rosetta Stone, a written document, says the most mundane things. It's not important for what it says. It's important for how it says it. When the first scholars read it, they were hoping it would say, this stone is about to reveal a marvelous secret, and you who read it will be the first to understand it. But it doesn't say that. It goes on line after line. This is written by Ptolemy, Ptolemy the Great, Ptolemy the Magnificent, Ptolemy the best of them all. Did we mention how great Ptolemy is? Had I told you that Ptolemy was the best, the first and the tallest and the strongest? And it goes on like that line after line. And the scholars reading this Greek are in a panic that here we'd hope for this marvelous insight, and all we're hearing is what a big deal Ptolemy was. And we're getting pretty close to the end. And then just before the Greek runs out, the last line of it says, and since I am so marvelous, we must proclaim my greatness to all the world, and we should proclaim it in 3 languages so that no one could miss the message. And that's what this stone is. And that's why these 3 messages on the stone say the same thing in 3 different scripts. So finally, it turned out just what the scholars had hoped for. It really was the same thing said in different ways. But you had to make it all the way past the bombast to see that. So that's what it says. I'm Ptolemy. I'm the Pharaoh. I'm marvelous. Let me tell you just how marvelous.
And because he wanted as many people as possible to understand his marvelousness, it was written in 3 different languages.
Yes, and there were evidently once upon a time lots of Rosetta Stones. They were meant to set this document up in temples all across the land, so that everyone would read. Here's Ptolemy. Here's what he's done. The only one that we found is this particular one that you went to see.
Somebody in the audience asks, did both scholars later write to explain how they cracked the code?
No. They were great rivals. To this day, Egyptologists and historians knock heads about just who really did the greater work. Most people think Champollion, the Frenchman, but it's still a fight. Generally speaking, the English are, you will not be astonished to hear, in favor of the Englishmen, and the French in favor of the Frenchmen. No, Champollion was a flamboyant, over the top character, much more inclined to say, look at what I've done, than to say, let me tell you the painstaking steps I took to get this far. And Young too was inclined much more to say, here it is, than to reveal the magic, how the trick was done.
Somebody asks, is this all absolutely settled linguistics, or might a linguistic detective in the future conclude that Young and the Frenchman had it all wrong?
Well, that's a terrific question. And it would have been possible, although difficult, for these translations to have been wrong, because Champollion and Young explained how they did it, that this symbol stands for the letter L, and so you could go and look at other words and see if it fit. But still, there wasn't a check, and so the questioner has it right. It's possible that this could all be a pipe dream, but after Champollion and Young, a few decades later, someone found a counterpart of the Rosetta Stone, another document with a different message, but this one also in hieroglyphs and in Demotic and in Greek. And so now what you could do with the second thing, you could translate the hieroglyphs on this second Rosetta Stone according to Champollion and Young and see what you got, because you knew from the Greek on this second stone what you would get if you did it right. And it turned out that it was exactly right. And the scholars who found this second stone are awestruck. They said it's as if a mummy has risen from his tomb and stripped off his bandages and spoken to us.
So someone asked, can we now read all the hieroglyphics that we have found? Or are some still impenetrable?
Well, we can't quite. I'm at the cast sat on the mat stage, and I'm kind of proud of myself if I can read that much. But yes, scholars can absolutely read it. There are occasional words that haven't appeared anywhere else that you have to guess at. But no, the one reason that Egypt has kept its allure when other ancient cultures haven't is that we know so much more about it than any other culture.
I love this question. Do we now understand what ancient Egyptian would sound like as a spoken language?
Well, we kind of do. And that's a terrific question too, because if you think about it, if English had disappeared thousands of years ago and we were archaeologists in the future and we found some English texts and we somehow figured out about the alphabet and sounded it out, we see CAT written down and we'd say k-a-t. But to know that sounds meant this little furry guy with whiskers, that would be a big leap. So we know how to read these Egyptian. We know they didn't write with vowels in the way that Hebrew and Arabic aren't with vowels. So scholars have to guess at that much of the sound. But you know from sounding out dozens and dozens, thousands of things like Ptolemy and Cleopatra, you know a large number of sounds. So you can sound out more or less ancient Egyptian. You know, until Thomas Edison, every human voice ever was lost. So that's 1880, something like that. So we can almost hear these voices from 2000 BC, but with this caveat that we're guessing at the vowel sounds.
Well, you make that point, and I think for those of us who are language nerds, which is a huge proportion of people who attend programs for Planet Word, You say the problem is that every language divvies up the world's sounds in its own way. We speak with an accent when we venture into a foreign language precisely because the pigeonholes of our old language don't suit the sounds and melody and rhythm of the new language. Speakers of a given language may find themselves unable to produce some sounds or even hear some sounds that turn up all the time in other languages. So in addition to all these challenges of decoding the written word and having some sense of the consonants, there may be sounds in Egyptian that we don't even really hear as different as native English speakers.
Yes, I say we could hear the sound, but you're right. There is that giant problem. It's possible that it was a tonal language like Chinese or lots of
Right.
others, in which case what we're guessing at could be way off target. It's really unlikely that an Egyptologist would have a good accent in ancient Egypt if he were transplanted. When scholars talk about reading things, they tend to mean sounding it out rather than being able to drop into the library at Alexandria and check out a book or a stone tablet.
Somebody asks, you mentioned that you had the Rosetta Stone postcard at your desk for 20 years. What was the factor that finally blasted it through your consciousness so that it arrived as a book idea in your mind?
I was at a Thai restaurant with very poor service, waiting, and I'd read everything I could think to read. And I was looking at the menu, and I was going to get soup. And one of the soups was tom kha gai, which is coconut soup. And another soup was tom something or other. So it dawned on me that, I bet tom means soup. And I bet in this Thai script, there's tom in here somewhere. But I couldn't figure out even how to solve that mystery. And finally, it seemed to me, boy, with those clues, if you're stymied that quickly, maybe you ought to learn about the greatest deciphering story of them all and figure out how in the world anybody could solve a genuine mystery when even this tiny, tiny hintlet of a mystery was too much for me to take on.
And you're not a linguist by training, it must be said. You're a writer and have written about a lot of mysteries and puzzles and great narrative nonfiction. But this was sort of your first dive into the structure of language. Yes, is that right?
Yeah, this was new to me, and that was part of the fun, was to try to learn something new. But as we said earlier, it's also more approachable than lots of mysteries, than relativity or black holes or something. You can come pretty close to, if not the answers, to catching on at least to what the questions are.
So the book is called Writing of the Gods. I highly recommend it. We did talk a little bit about the race between Young and Champollion. I'm not going to reveal a blatant winner because I think that would just be too much of a spoiler. But I think it's really a terrific book. And thank you so much for being here for the last hour. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it was a treat for me. Thank you. When I was in 5th grade, I'll say as a final thing, we used to have to write book reports. And I used to end all my book reports with, if you want to know how this exciting book ends, you will have to read it.
There you go. Words to live by. And thank you
all these years later
so much for being here. Thank you for your continued support of Planet Word. We hope you will come see us in person if you're here in Washington and feel comfortable coming to museums. We are open Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 5. And if you ever want to come visit and see that the advance passes have all been reserved, don't let that stop you. We always do welcome walk-ups. So come see us if you haven't yet. And thank you all for joining us online. Good night, everyone.